Hello and welcome to JavaScript for WordPress developers learning the basics. In this tutorial and the ones ahead, we'll be taking a look at JavaScript, which is rapidly becoming the most important language on the web. Up until now, WordPress developers have mostly been concerned with PHP, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript took a backseat to all of that. Sure, you could add great functionality, but it was all built on top of HTML, CSS, and PHP, more as an afterthought mostly. Nowadays, with technologies that allow you to write backend JavaScript and much more mature tools available, JavaScript is taking front and center, which is pretty obvious when you take a look at the tools being built, like for example Calypso, which is a front end for WordPress written purely in JavaScript. So JavaScript is becoming really important, and I think it's high time that developers get to know JavaScript really well, and not just jQuery, but pure JavaScript as well. So in this course, or in this tutorial, we'll take a look at the absolute basics that you need to know to get up and running with JavaScript. Now, the good news is that you don't need all that much to get started. All you're going to need is a browser and a simple HTML file. On my computer, I've created a JavaScript folder on my desktop, and I've dragged that into my text editor of choice, which is Atom. You can use any one you like, it doesn't really matter. So within this JavaScript folder, I'm going to create index.html, and then copy paste some boilerplate code into it that I've pre-written. It's very simple. It's just a simple HTML5 document. It has a head with the compulsory title, and then it has a body which is empty. This is where my HTML would go, and on the bottom of it all I've created a script tag into which we're going to write our JavaScript. So if you copy paste this, just start writing JavaScript right here. The first thing that we're going to do is figure out how we can show our work, how we can check our work to display something on the screen. Now there are three ways to do this. I'm going to show you console logging first, which is the way I like to do things and most developers like to do things. Before we begin, let's take a look at what the console actually is. Let's open up this index file. Let me just drag that in here. And it should be completely empty. We don't have anything in there yet. Just so you can see that this is actually working, let me just add hello there here. There we go. There we are. So you can open up the console by pressing Command Option J on the Mac, and I believe it's Control Alt J on Windows, but if you can't find it, you can go to you can go to View, Developer, and JavaScript Console. It should bring up this window with lots and lots of controls. What you're basically looking at just here is a console which will display messages like errors from JavaScript and anything that you want to show here. So let's get started and use the console. And delete this, and let's just type console.log hello. So if you refresh the page, you should see nothing. We deleted the hello there text, but if you open up the console, you should see hello being shown here. So this is one of the best ways to figure out what's going on because it's not shown to the user, and it allows you to log error messages, to log just status messages so you can see what's going on, or to just log something from your code so you know what the value is, which will become especially important when you start working with variables and functions where you might not immediately know what value variable takes on. The other way to do things is this is my kind of second favorite, although I don't really use it a lot, is to use alert. Alert will create a JavaScript alert, so if you refresh the page, it will show this little annoying alert box, which normally is annoying, but you can use it to very quickly show the value of something. I use it very rarely. I prefer console logging. Sometimes when I have millions of windows open, it's just quicker to do it this way. There is a third way, which is sometimes used in normal JavaScript code, not just for debugging. It's called document.write. And what this does is basically like echoing for PHP. It actually puts this within the document. So if you refresh the page here, the text hello there will actually be in there. And you can write HTML in here. So once JavaScript runs, once this part of JavaScript runs, this hello there is actually a part of your HTML. So you can highlight it and see that the document actually contains this H1 here. Next, we're going to learn about how to add JavaScript to our document. You've already seen the first method, which is to add a script tag to the body and just write your JavaScript in there. Now the second method involves the same thing, but doing it in the head section. This is normally not something which you'd want to do. Mostly you would want to put all your JavaScript code in the body after all your HTML content. The reason is that when JavaScript is loaded from the header, it's loaded before all of the content, and if something goes wrong, your content will not be loaded. Or if you're pulling in a JavaScript library from somewhere else, again, it might slow down your website speed considerably. So whenever you can, add JavaScript to the body. Sometimes it's you can't prevent it. Sometimes you have to add JavaScript in the header, but try to do it as little as possible. The third method involves pulling in JavaScript from elsewhere. And for that, you would use the script tag, but you would use it a bit differently. So instead of just using the script tag and writing JavaScript right in there, you would add a source parameter or argument and just give it a location of your JavaScript file. So let's create that right here, scripts.js, and just type scripts.js here. There we go. So if I can alert something here, let's give it a go. There we go. The alerting works just fine. There we are. So now our JavaScript is being pulled from a separate file. Now this is normally how you would want to add JavaScript in your page, by pulling it from a different file, although in some cases it can be helpful or even sometimes needed to add JavaScript inline. For now, I'm going to copy paste this line of code inside the body. There we are. So let's use our JavaScript like this mostly. Okay, finally, let's start learning about JavaScript itself. We're going to take a look at the building blocks of JavaScript, starting with variables. Variables are, they're just the same as PHP variables. In fact, if you're familiar with the basics of PHP, you can mostly skip over this lesson from now on. The only reason you might want to stay is for how to actually write the code. It differs a little bit from PHP, but the essence of it is much the same. So, on to variables. In many cases, you're going to want to store a value which is used again and again. For example, will be a very simple one. If you use a name a lot, you can actually substitute the value that you use a lot with a variable. So in this case, I'm going to write a bunch of text right here on the page. So this is what it ends up being. As you can see, I use Daniel quite a lot. So what I can do is use a variable, and the way you would do that is say var, which means this will be a variable, name equals Daniel, and then right here I'll show you why we write it the way we do, but for now the point is to understand the example. Instead of writing Daniel here, I'm going to write name, and I'm going to repeat this for all the instances of Daniel. There we go. So now, if you take a look at this example, it's actually exactly the same. The reason it's a lot more useful is I can replace the name just by doing that in one go. I don't need to go through all the lines. Now, for example, if you're using a color value which you use throughout your application, that color value might be used, 300 times. If you would want to replace that color value, you would need to go through each of your files, do a search and replace, or something like that. In this way, you can just define the value of the color and then use the variable in every instance, and it makes it very easy to manage your code. Now let's look at some of the syntax quickly. So we've already seen that you define a variable by typing var and then the name of the variable that you want to use. So in this case, it's name, which makes it a bit confusing. But the point is that this is how you will refer to the value later on. Then you make it equal to something, which in this case is John right now. Now, as you can see, I used quotes to show that this is a string value. A string is anything which would use alphanumeric characters and should be treated as text, basically. You could also have a variable which is a number, let's say age, and that could be 31. As you can see, there is no parentheses here, not parentheses, there are no quotes here, because this signifies that this is an integer, a number value. This tells JavaScript that you can add and subtract this value from other similar integer or number values. You can't subtract John from Daniel, but you can subtract 31 from 5. And that's basically it for assigning values to variables. There are a couple of more types of values, for example, arrays or functions, but we'll take a look at that a bit later. Now here, this is called string concatenation. That basically means you're putting together multiple strings. So for example, if I were to write document.write, hello, Mr. Daniel. That's perfectly good. I could also do it this way. I have two strings. I have hello and I have Mr. Daniel. And I'd like to put these together, so I write a plus. This will concatenate the values. What you need to be careful of is that this way there will be no space between hello and Mr. So you do need to add that somewhere. It's a small consideration, but it's worth keeping in mind. Now, the same thing goes for using variables. So this variable is actually a string. So what I would do here is what I've done above. So the way I would write that is I have a string named hello space. Then I would like to use a variable. So I use plus and the variable. And then I'd like to use another string. So I use another plus and then the other string. So that's it for concatenation. And now you should be able to use variables and values to output some text. Next up is functions. Functions allow you to reuse functionality in a really easy way. So again, let's look at a very simple example. As you know, Twitter usernames look like this. It's basically a string with an @ in front. So how do you create that? What you do is, let's say you have a variable named username. And that equals, there we go. Now you want to generate a Twitter username for this. What you could do is use string concatenation. So you would use that. This is fine, but this won't really happen for Twitter. But what happens if Twitter decides that instead of using the @ they want to switch it to the #? You would need to go through your code and search for all instances of @ and then try and replace that with the hash. Now the problem here is that you will probably use @ elsewhere as well. So you can't really do a search and replace because sometimes, it will replace something that you don't want to replace. So this is a case where functions come in handy. What you can do is say that this function should be, again, we'll look at the syntax later. So we have a function named make Twitter username. And what this function does, it takes a name and then basically uses the same string concatenation to say, let's return an @ followed by the name. And now let's try to console log something. For example, let's console log make Twitter username and let's give it our username. There we are. So now if we console log that, let's look at the log, we'll get @Daniel Pataki. So what's going on here? Here is actually where it all starts in the var username. Let's put that up here. So first of all, I've defined a username, which is my username, Daniel Pataki. Then I want to log a value and I want to log this value. I want to use the make Twitter username function and I am going to pass it my username, which is now Daniel Pataki. So this function, and now everything else that goes on is in this function. So I've invoked this function, which takes an argument, and the argument I've passed it was Daniel Pataki right here. So the value of this variable name is Daniel Pataki. So I'm returning an @ plus my name. And returning it means that the value of this function with this argument will be returned. So the value of this will be @Daniel Pataki. Now the value of this, or the reason that it's really useful, is that if Twitter changes something and decides to use a #, all you need to do is this, and it will work just fine. Now, functions are usually a bit more elaborate than this, but this is the basic reason for their use. So you can reuse them, because anytime I want to create a Twitter name from a username, I can just use make Twitter username. There we go. Or even There we go. And it will make a Twitter username. Now, let's look at the syntax of these functions. To create a function, first use the keyword function, and then name your function something descriptive. You don't need to make it short particularly. It shouldn't be overly long, but it should be, it should be expressive of what the function does. If you can only do that with 2 or 3 words and underscores, that's fine. The point is to know what the function does. So for example, create Twitter username from string. Now that makes it pretty obvious what this is. Now, any parameters that you want the function to use, you can add here. So I know that this function will take a username. There we go. But you could also create a function which can prepend any sort of string to your username. So you could say prepend string to username. So this way you can make it a more globally useful function. So you could pass it a username and a string to prepend to it. Prepend, there we go. All right, so in this case, this function takes 2 arguments. What you would do here is instead of make Twitter username, what you would do is prepend string to username. You would pass it the username, which is Daniel Pataki, and you would pass it the @. Again, this might not be useful. For example, what you need to consider here is how you're using your function. So again, if you're going to use it to create Twitter usernames, this may not be a good example. The reason being is when Twitter actually changes this and decides to put a hashtag instead of @, you need to go through your code again and take a look at all the @. So this would actually be detrimental, even though it's a more globally useful function in the sense that you can do more with it. But that's not always what you need to do. Sometimes it's better to have more specific functions. Either way, let's take a look at how this would work. So you put the code of the function within the curly braces, and you would say var string, this is the resulting string, so we can take a new string, equals prepend plus username. There we go. Now, as you saw before, you probably will want to return a value. Let's return new string. So this will make this string available, and it will make sure that this actually has a value. In some cases, you won't return a value because sometimes the function does something else, like for example, change the text of an H1 or something like that. But in many cases, you will want to return a value. So this will actually work the same way. Oops. So now you should see the same thing at Daniel Pataki. Okay, so this is how multiple arguments work, and this is how you write a function. Again, keep in mind that how your function will be used. As we said in this case, for example, the Twitter case, it's actually better to create a more specific function, because if something changes, you'll be able to manage your code better. The last thing we're going to take a look at today is arrays. Arrays are one of the most important constructs in all programming languages. You can find them from PHP, C, C#, JavaScript, Java, basically anything where you need programming, you need arrays. Arrays are actually pretty simple. They're just a collection of data, and that's it. If you remember previously, we had strings, and we had a look at integers or numbers as well. Now an array would be nothing more than a construct that contains multiple types of data. So for example, an array would be defined like this, with square brackets, and you write each data with separating them with commas. So we could have 26, then 73, then Daniel, then 87. You could also add another array in there, so the next value for this array would be an array. And the array could be, a collection of simple numbers again, and the next value could be John. I'm very narcissistic using my name all the time, sorry about that. So that's basically all you need to know about arrays. There are a collection of types of data, and the reason they're very useful is that usually it allows you to collect data which has something to do with each other. For example, your consumption of calories in a week. That'll be something like that, I assume. You had a pizza right here. You had some salads. You porked out a bit on Saturday, and there we go. So this would be your calorie consumption for a week, from Monday up until Sunday. And you can do a lot with arrays. You can add all the values up, which would give you your total calorie consumption for the week. You could take a look at the average, which would give you the average number of calories you eat per day, and so on. It's really important that you know how to work with arrays, how to add values, take values from an array, how to create arrays, and so on, because you'll be using them a lot. So this is one method where you've seen that I've just basically built an array. Now, you'll have many cases where you have an array created, and then throughout your code, you'll need to add a value to it. And you can do that pretty easily. Let's first console log out this calories thing. And you can see that if you take a look at the code, oh, there's an unexpected token on line 2. Oh yes, I've used a dash instead of an equal sign. Sorry about that. There we go. You can see this array here. And it has all the numbers that we have added. Now let's go ahead and add another number. And we can do that by using the push method. Calories, that would be your array. And we'll use a function on it named push. And we'll push, the next Monday's calorie count. Let's make it 1689, and then let's log out those calories again. So what you should see in the console is first you're console logging the calories, which should contain 7 values. Then you've added a value, so the next time you console log it, it should have 8 values. There we go. So here's our value added at the very end. Now we can add values to the end of arrays, but how do we actually grab a value from this array? Well, what you can do is you can use this notation. Let's log out. By the way, if you're using Atom, you don't have to type console log. You can just type log and then press tab. Handy tip there. And you can use calories, square brackets, and then the key of the value. Now, the first value would have the key of 0. The second value would have the key of 1. The third one would have the key of 2, and so on. So basically, if you want the third value from this array, which is this one, you would type 2. And it's 2 because in programming, almost always the first value is value 0. So you would say 0, 1, 2. You need the second one. So let's console log that out. It's 2,638, and indeed it is. So that was pretty easy. There is another thing that you can use, which is calculating the length of the array, which would give you how many values it actually has. So let's console log calories dot length. Now this is a bit different from other functions. You don't need the parentheses at the end. Don't worry about why. The point is that this gives you the length of the array, which is 7. You can mix and match any of these, functions that you've used. Like for example, what if you want the second last value, so this one? Now you could say that you want value 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. It should be, oh yeah, sorry, 5, yes. I got mixed up with the 0, didn't I? There we go, so that should be 2,812. There we are. Now, in many cases, you won't know how long your array is. If you're continuously logging your calories, this could be day 436. You don't really know. But what you can do is, instead of using 5, you can use calories dot length minus 1. And that should give you the same value, 1,787. Oops, sorry about that. Oh yes, I was a bit silly there. There we are. So calories.length, the reason I made a mistake, again with the 0, is that calories.length is 7, right? So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 values. Now calories.length minus 1 was 6, but the way that you get the item is that you use the index, and the first one is 0. So calories.length minus 1 is 6, so that would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That would be actually the last value. So you need to use minus 2. There we go. You see, everyone makes mistakes, don't worry about it too much. There we are. So that's one way to manipulate arrays and get their values. One more way to work with arrays is to loop through them using a map function. Now, loops are commonly found in all programming languages again, so knowing this will give you an advantage when learning a new language. So let's say we want to display these calories for each day. How would you go about doing that? We already know that we can use document.write, and we could do something like calories 0. That's fine if you take a look at the web page. That's the video being created. Ooh. There we go. So that would be 1782. Right. So if you would want to show each of them, first of all, you would need to go through all of them like that. I'll just do it until 2. And the second problem as well is that you would need to add some formatting because it's just one after the other. So you would actually need to write something like that. You need to create a list item and then even use document.write to create the list tag. There we go. Well, that looks a bit nicer, but it was a lot of work to get done. So what you can do is, well, especially if you have like 500 array values, what you could do is, this code is mostly the same. All that differs in it is the index. So you could just use a map. And the way that will work is you would use calories.map, and in here you would create a function. This is called an anonymous function, and this function would figure out what to do with each value. The function gets 2 parameters. It gets the number of, sorry, the actual value, and it also gets the index of the value. Right, so what you could do is, we don't really need the index right now, but what we could do is, instead of all this, we just copy paste this in here and then replace calories 0 with just a simple value. There we go. So let's see, there we go. So what's happening here? Using the map function, we're looping through all these calories. So on the first pass, we'll be receiving this value inside the function. On the second pass, we'll be receiving this one, and so on right until we get to the end. So on each pass, the function takes a parameter which will be this value, so we can use that in our code here. So basically what happens here is we're going to write a list item, take this value, end the list item. Then we're going to write a list item, take this value, and write a list item. So it basically just loops through everything, allowing you to work very efficiently with arrays. Now that brings us to the end of this beginner's course. What I would recommend you to do before you start the next course is to take a look at a place like W3 Schools, which has a JavaScript tutorial. There are a lot of things which I haven't mentioned or haven't gone into detail. It would take a long time. But if you've understood the concepts and if you've understood basically how everything works, you should have no trouble reading about JavaScript. So for example, you could take a look at the syntax to figure out when you actually need a semicolon at the end of the line. You could take a look at variables in depth. You can take a look at data types, which doesn't just contain integers and strings, but also shows you things like objects, which will be in the next lesson. And you can basically learn a lot more of the depth that there is to JavaScript. I really recommend you do that. It doesn't really matter if you don't understand everything. The way to learn a programming language is not to understand every single thing about variables and functions the first time around. Just understand the concepts and start using them. I look forward to seeing you all in the next lesson, which will be about objects. See you there.